Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reading Kimonos in Modern Japanese Literature, the case of Kōda Aya. I'm Grace Gailey, here pre-recorded from New York City with the Japan Foundation New York's Japanese Studies team. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight's lecture is the third installment of our online series, Illuminating Japanese Studies, lecture series with former Japan Foundation fellows. This series explores the world of Japanese studies with former recipients of the Japan Foundation's Japanese Studies Fellowship Award. If you joined us live on March the 29th, you'll recall that we experienced some technical difficulties and we were unable to stream this presentation live. That said, we're pleased to bring it to you tonight as a pre-recorded question and answer session. We will be addressing some of the questions that we received by Eventbrite as well. So thank you for your patience, and I hope that you're enjoying this video now at a later date. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Michiko Suzuki. Dr. Suzuki is an associate professor of modern Japanese literature and comparative literature at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Suzuki received our long-term research fellowship in 2019, and her current book project is titled Reading Material, Kimono in 20th-Century Japanese Literature and Film. The following question and answer session will be moderated by Dr. Kimberly Kono, Professor of Japanese in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Smith College, where she's also affiliated with the Program for the Study of Women and Gender and the Translation Studies concentration. Her current research focuses on images of Japanese women in colonial Manchuria. For more information about our speakers, please see the description box below this video. Per the United States and Japan's copyright laws, the images and media shown in this presentation are for the sole purpose of and are limited to the extent necessary for academic discussion. As a nonprofit organization, we do not profit from this video. Now, let's begin the lecture.
I would like to thank the Japan Foundation for inviting me to give this talk today and for their dedicated support for Japan studies. I'm very grateful to the Japan Foundation for their promotion of academic research on Japan, for myself and for others as well. I'd also like to thank Professor Kim Kono for moderating. Here's a brief outline of my talk today. In recent years, there has been a welcome increase in academic studies of kimonos and wafuku, or Japanese wear more broadly. My research has a unique place within this area because I work in the fields of literature and culture. In my current project, I examine how kimonos create complex layers of meaning within modern literary texts, and I'm especially interested in the meanings that have been overlooked or forgotten by readers today. The language of clothes, the idea that clothing speaks about the wearer's identity and the world they inhabit, has long been established in fields such as fashion studies and folkloristics. Kimonos, robe-like traditional Japanese clothing, and their accompanying garments and accessories also function in this way as a form of communication, whether they're worn by a real-life individual or a fictional character. Liza Dalby, for example, uses the term language of kimono to discuss what is conveyed through the kimono itself, as well as the rules and protocols associated with it. We can easily imagine how a kimono worn by a literary character would tell us something about the character's age, gender, material status, class, wealth, occupation, regional identity, and so on. But in addition, literary kimonos also convey such things as socio-historical commentary, hidden symbolic meanings within the plot, and intricate intertextual references. In this way, kimono language has long been used as an important means of communication between author and reader. Indeed, scholars have particularly recognized the significance of kimono language in literary works from the pre-modern and early modern periods, as character and plot in these texts are often intimately connected to aspects of material culture. However, in modern literature from the Meiji period on, kimonos have not been extensively examined for literary interpretation. They are usually relegated to footnotes or explained simply as details that produce realism. And when treated as an extension of their wearers, garments tend to be read rather simply, for example, as showing someone's wealth or taste in fashion. In my research, I examine kimonos in 20th century literature and film, seeking to uncover what they can tell us about a broad range of things. I explore textile, color, design, pattern, styles, and so on, but also the specific historical contexts of the objects, as well as the references they make to other literary or cinematic works. Kimonos exist and continue to be enjoyed in our contemporary world, but historical and cultural knowledge about them have waned. One reason for this is that they are no longer considered common everyday clothing. They were superseded by Western clothes as normative daily wear after the Second World War. The kimono is no longer an intrinsic part of everyday life in the same way as it was in the past. And in the past, until the mid-20th century, kimonos were not simply clothing. They effectively served as portable currency, items that could be traded, gifted, and pawned for cash. Many women brought them into their marriage as trousseaux. Some were quite extensive, including complete wardrobes to be worn throughout their lives. Although many kinds of kimonos were made by specialists, lower-ranked everyday kimonos and yukata, summer kimonos, were sewn at home, and some families even did their own weaving and dyeing. On one level, kimonos have a sense of finality as items handed down through the generations. At the same time, however, they were immensely flexible and fluid. They were taken apart for laundering, resewn, redyed, and when finally worn out, they were remade into other garments and items. Historically, and even now, kimonos are worn by men, women, and children. But until the mid-20th century, they were particularly integral to the lives of women, who usually carried out or oversaw domestic work and maintained all aspects of the family's wardrobe. In pre-war Japan, when women had limited legal rights or means of self-realization, owning, creating, and wearing garments could serve as an important avenue for self-expression. The kimono today may look relatively similar to those of the early to mid-20th century, but its meaning and place in the world have greatly changed. As a scholar, I have always been interested in excavating lost meanings in texts, as well as the complex ways in which meaning is produced through interactions amongst author, text, and reader. I find 20th century literary kimonos fascinating because they're connected to vernacular everyday practices and knowledge that have disappeared or changed, and because they take on different meanings at different historical moments. During the war, for example, kimonos were coded as frivolous and anti-patriotic compared to the nationally sanctioned monpe, or traditional style trousers. Monpe, rather than kimonos, allow more mobility and match the wartime ethos of austerity during a time of national emergency. But after the war, kimonos, especially as high-end luxury items, came to be touted as traditional Japanese dress. Because of such cultural shifts, writers and readers of different periods view kimono differently, and even a single text depicting kimonos may be understood differently over time. My research focuses on a variety of authors, texts, and films, but today I'd like to talk about the writer Kōda Aya. Kōda Aya is particularly important as a kimono connoisseur and author who was deeply aware of kimono language. Even as she wrote works featuring kimonos, she also understood that everyday knowledge about this garment was declining in the post-war period. Kōda is the daughter of Kōda Rohan, a famous Meiji writer. She began her career at age 43 in 1947, writing essays about her father after his death, and went on to become a highly respected author in her own right. Kōda Aya's writing on kimonos includes both nonfiction essays as well as fiction, but the novel titled Kimono is perhaps the best known. Kimono is a female coming-of-age story set in the early 20th century. The protagonist, Rutsuko, grows up and learns about the world through her engagement with kimonos in 1910s and 20s Tokyo. As Anne Sharif, who has written about this novel, says, quote, "Kimonos are the means by which Rutsuko comes to develop her own sense of personhood," end quote. Rutsuko learns all aspects of kimono knowledge, including different textiles, protocol, and how to wear, maintain, mend, gift, and repurpose kimonos. Through sartorial and tactile experiences, she also learns about her own tastes and how to present herself. Through these items of clothing that are so closely hued to female life, Rutsuko learns about people, money, worldviews, society, and even sexuality and morality. The novel was first serialized during 1965 to 68, but was never finished. It was not published in book form until 1993, a few years after Kōda's death. Due to its content and unique publication history, this work requires us to think about kimonos during three different historical moments: the early 20th century, in which the story is set, Japan's economic boom of the late 1960s when it was first serialized, and the economically stagnant lost decade of the 1990s when it was resurrected and published as a book. Although the novel was never finished, it has a clear narrative arc. We see Rutsuko's growing up process, learning about kimonos mainly from her grandmother, and having various experiences that pertain in some way to garments. As she matures, she sees her two sisters wed, she experiences the illness and death of her mother, and she graduates from higher girls' school. The family loses their home and all their belongings in the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, and sometime afterwards, Rutsuko marries a man that the family does not approve of. The narrative concludes on her wedding night, an unromantic and rather unpleasant event that does not bode well for the couple's future. While creating a compelling story about a girl's coming of age, the novel implicitly educates 1960s readers about various aspects of early 20th century material culture in a middle-class Tokyo setting. Readers, along with Rutsuko, are taught by her grandmother. The text is written for the most part in an accessible manner full of explanations. Already by the 1960s, scholars were noting that the kimono was, quote, dying out as a form of everyday dress, end quote, and, quote, reemerging as a form of ceremonial or formal dress, end quote. Even basic knowledge, such as how a certain fabric feels on the skin or drapes when worn, or how to wear a kimono by oneself, was already disappearing. However, the goal for Rutsuko and the reader's education is not simply to amass such information. They must learn to become good readers of kimonos. The novel suggests that for Rutsuko, this skill makes her a better person, able to fully appreciate the broader world connected to this garment. Let me provide some examples of how kimono language is deployed in this work. In explaining Rutsuko's character, the novel presents the first kimono she selects by herself as an important indicator of her inner nature. A headstrong girl who has unique aesthetic tastes, but also goes against the norms of age and gender. She chooses the fabric for her kimono from a pile of discounted cloth, a smooth beige habutae, a type of silk fabric, with dark purple, green, and brown lines of different widths, creating a large checkered pattern. She specifically avoids red colors, standard for girls' kimonos, as well as designs associated with children, such as large chrysanthemum flowers and mandarin ducks in the water. When Rutsuko sees this habutae, it is love at first sight. Behaving in a manner considered inappropriate for girls, she grabs the bolt of cloth stacked out of reach by herself, upsetting piles of merchandise and almost injuring herself. Through information subtly provided before, during, and after this episode, the reader understands historical information, that at this time in Tokyo, habutae fabric was normally only made into men's kimonos. The checked pattern of muted colors is also unexpected for a girl of Rutsuko's age. Furthermore, the reader learns that the combination of a check design with the expense of silk makes this a very unusual item. Checks are considered a casual pattern, not appropriate for formal wear, so most people would not find this fabric at all desirable, and in fact, the item had not sold for a long time. In short, the cloth Rutsuko chooses for her kimono is one of a kind and defies both gender and age appropriateness. The reader, having made this connection, can understand that this object actually reflects Rutsuko herself, an unconventional girl who behaves and thinks in an unfeminine manner. Rutsuko is overlooked by most people, but is appreciated by those able to value unexpected treasures. The reader can then also think about the other aspect of this representation, that Rutsuko might be too unusual and unexpected, like this checked habutae. Will she be able to adequately conform to society and achieve a successful marriage, the goal for women at this time? The fabric was originally rejected by the person who commissioned it, and it had been lying around unsold for years, becoming partially discolored and stained. It was certainly a bargain, but such an unwanted item could also be considered inauspicious. By providing key information about kimono rules and norms, such as habutae usage and design, the text cultivates the reader's ability to connect the dots and interpret beyond the surface. This kimono, which Rutsuko wears throughout her youth, provides important messages about her character. By the time of the novel's serialization, Kōda had already published many essays about kimonos, written in an accessible style, often descriptive and evocative works that introduce readers to the historical past of kimonos, as well as rules and issues of taste. The novel, in a more subtle way, reflects similar qualities. As someone committed to the transmission of knowledge about kimono culture, Kōda is very mindful of the need for exposition, even in the context of fiction. At the same time, various parts of the novel require readers to have prior knowledge, or at least be able to extrapolate about certain items and what they signify. The mourning kimono Rutsuko wears to the funeral of her mother is a good example. Rutsuko had been the primary caregiver for her mother throughout her long illness and is still a student when her mother dies. To provide some background, her two older sisters are already married at this point. The eldest unnamed beautiful sister has successfully married into a wealthy family, and her parents had provided her with many high-quality kimonos and futon as her trousseau. Of the sisters, she is the richest, but is very stingy and provides little assistance to her natal family. She's always dressed immaculately, but is self-centered and vulgar. The second sister, Mitsuko, is more likable, but is similar to the eldest sister in that her worldview and self-identity are shaped by her husband and his family. Her ideas and even her taste in clothing conform to his desires. Marrying into this merchant family, she has asked her parents for cash instead of a trousseau in order to match their pragmatic values. Rutsuko is different from her married sisters who are focused on themselves and their husbands' families. Despite having a difficult relationship with her mother, she has remained loyal to her own family and sacrificed herself in a number of ways. After her mother passes away, she's deeply affected and cannot even think about what she should wear to the funeral. But her grandmother presents her with a suitable kimono, stressing the importance of following protocol. Rutsuko thus attends the event wearing a dark purple silk iromuji with a single family crest. Iromuji means single-colored kimono with no patterns. Seeing this choice of funeral wear appropriate for an unmarried young woman, the eldest sister grins knowingly and comments, quote, "You did well asking for such a nice kimono. Was it a reward for taking care of the sick patient? I'm jealous that purple looks so wonderful against your pale skin. But why did you choose to use harimon? That is so déclassé," end quote. The materialistic sister only sees this kimono as a reward that Rutsuko successfully manages to snatch up. She congratulates her on this addition to her property, but asks with disdain why the family crest is a patch and did not appear directly on the kimono fabric itself. The wealthy, impeccably dressed married sister questions the harimon, which she considers lower class and in bad taste. In contrast to the earlier example of Rutsuko's favorite kimono, in which Kōda implicitly educates readers in kimono language by explaining about habutae and the check pattern, this is an example in which Kōda assumes knowledge of her readers. In this episode, she does not explain what a harimon is or why it is there. Harimon is an obscure term for readers today, but many 1960s readers would likely have still understood it. The type of formal family crest that the sister would presumably have preferred instead of harimon is a dye reserve crest made by reserving the white color of the kimono fabric itself before it is dyed. So I don't have an image here of harimon, but this is image of dye reserve crest. For a single crested kimono, the family crest appears on the back of the kimono below the neck. Unlike a crest made on a new bolt of cloth, like here, the harimon, which is a patch, suggests the reuse of an older kimono. Although the story does not clarify the reason for its use, the harimon dyed out on separate small pieces of cloth was often affixed over a different family crest or patched over a crest that had become imperfect in some way due to the process of remaking a used kimono. Its use hints at economic considerations and the limitations the grandmother faced in creating this outfit, which likely entailed redyeing and resewing an old kimono into a suitable outfit for Rutsuko. Although the one-crested kimono appears as proper mourning clothes, if one looks carefully, it is a, quote, cobbled together funeral outfit, end quote. The sister's question is likely ironic. She may be well aware of the fact that harimon was used out of necessity because of the downturn in the family's finances and the inability of the family to purchase a new kimono. Even so, Kōda shows the sister as a limited reader of kimono. She's observant enough to realize that the crest is patched on, as she cannot see what it signifies beyond monetary worth and aesthetics. Rutsuko says nothing in response to her sister, nor does she analyze what the harimon signifies in the story, but her silence speaks volumes. It is clear for her, and for her readers as well, that this funeral kimono speaks of a complex network of human relationships, values, and emotional connections. While her sister's reading is purely on the surface, associating the harimon with Rutsuko's lack of taste or finances, Rutsuko's understanding of the kimono encompasses much more than the object itself. The deeper meaning of this harimon is her grandmother's thoughtfulness and resourceful housekeeping abilities, the intimate relationship between Rutsuko and her grandmother, and Rutsuko's own continued commitment to the family as represented by the family crest. At the funeral, the eldest sister dresses in the most formal, five-crested, black mourning kimono of the highest quality, but she cannot dress by herself and forces Rutsuko to help her. Mitsuko, the second sister, who appears in Western clothing, expresses dissatisfaction that Rutsuko outranked her by wearing a crested kimono. Both older sisters demonstrate that they are concerned with appearances, even arguing with relatives about the ranking order for the participants in the ceremony. While Rutsuko mourns her mother, the sisters and other relatives are focused on unimportant issues, even as the corpse is being cremated. They discuss in detail the special kimono worn by Rutsuko's wealthy friend at the funeral, from its fabric, woven pattern, color, and number of crests, and laugh at Rutsuko when she cannot recall much detail about it. This is ironic, of course, because they, not Rutsuko, are the superficial readers. Reading kimono well does not simply mean the ability to identify types of fabric and their rarity or cost. The sisters and other relatives might think Rutsuko is deficient, but their own concerns only reveal their lack of sensitivity about what truly matters, while Rutsuko has the insight to see the true value of her cobbled together outfit. Through such episodes, the text educates us in becoming skilled readers of kimono and shows the importance of cultivating such interpretive abilities. After learning valuable kimono lessons, including learning to appreciate human connections and to mourn the dead in a deep, meaningful way, Rutsuko marries. Despite her family's decline in fortunes after the Great Kanto earthquake, she manages to put together a suitable trousseau and organize an admirable ceremony with wedding kimonos that dazzle but are economical. Despite her understanding of the world through kimonos, however, Rutsuko has had little experience with love and sexuality, a blind spot in her education that leads her to fall in love with an unworthy man. Rutsuko is quiet at her own wedding, perhaps realizing her mistake, but a little too late. While I don't have the time to discuss it fully here, I should note that the novel's memorable opening scene shows Rutsuko's power and agency. She's depicted as a little girl who challenges gender norms and being scolded for tearing a sleeve off of an uncomfortable undergarment. In contrast, the novel ends on her wedding night with her being passively disrobed of her undergarment by her drunk husband. The scene unfolds in a very clinical, unromantic fashion, suggesting her loss of independence and agency. To be sure, it is a bleak ending, but novelist and literary critic Mizumura Minae has suggested that this foreshadows what is to come, that Rutsuko will ultimately reject the marriage, just as she has refused to wear certain kimonos in the past. Because the opening and closing scenes of the novel are linked through the image of disrobing, it is easy to forget that Kimono, the novel, was never actually finished, and that Kōda abandoned the serialization in 1968. Although she had originally planned to continue Rutsuko's story, she became too busy with other projects to complete the work. But there was another reason why this novel remained unfinished. Kōda's daughter, Aokitama, who is also a writer herself, explained that she tried to persuade her mother to continue the serialization, but Kōda had refused, citing the decline of kimono culture. Aoki paraphrases Kōda, quote, "No matter how much I write about the fun, beautiful, and interesting aspects of kimonos, it doesn't mean much if there is no one actually wearing them. When I was writing kimono, there was still something that was mutually understood, but as time passes by, it is no longer even something to be enjoyed, but has moved farther and farther away. If there is no mutual feeling, kyokan, no one will read it," end quote. In a sense, Kōda is refusing to speak a language that is no longer widely understood. She celebrates kimono culture in this novel by providing details of textiles, design, protocol, daily practice, and kimono-human connections. But what happens when the kimono is no longer something essential and intimately connected to everyday life? Perhaps she is imagining readers who, when reading about Rutsuko's funeral wear, will vaguely wonder, what is a harimon? And thus may not recognize the complex meanings it represents in the story. And even if the harimon was identified as an object, having familiarity with it is another matter. The kimono in late 1960s Japan was, in essence, a different object from what it was in the 1910s and 20s. And therefore, perhaps, it could no longer evoke mutual feeling in the same way. Unlike Kōda herself, who had worn, owned, taken care of, and thought about kimonos for over 60 years, the post-war generation was living a very different life when it came to material culture. In the late 1960s, kimonos were no longer a dominant part of the average Japanese wardrobe. But on the other hand, they were also very much part of fashion trends and as desired outfits for special occasions for those who could afford them. Kōda's work, although set in the early 20th century, is part of the post-war moment in which there was strong interest in kimonos. 1965, for example, the year Kōda began serializing the novel, is known as the year of the Wafuku revival, when various kimonos sold well and the so-called PTA look rose to prominence. The PTA look was what fashionable mothers wore to formal school events: black haori kimono jacket over iromuji or other kimonos. Kōda herself wrote an essay on the black haori phenomenon in 1968, addressing its popularity for women. With the so-called Izanagi economic boom, by 1968, Japan's GNP rose to second place in the world after the United States. With such prosperity in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, such desire for kimonos may have been partly due to a broader interest in Japanese culture and a sense of a national identity. But in addition, kimonos were also part of a rise in personal wealth and an expanding consumer culture. In 1968, many women may have owned black haori, but they were also wearing flared trousers and miniskirts. Regardless of the kimono's status in the late 1960s, Kōda's long-term predictions about the decline of kimono culture would come true. One source suggests that the market for kimonos in 1981 was half that of 1973, and in the next 10 years, it decreased by another 50%. Kimonos receded from everyday life and increasingly became part of specialty wear, and often something to be rented, not owned. Canceling the serialization of her novel must have been a difficult decision for Kōda, particularly for someone who not only wrote extensively on kimonos and used them as motifs in her fiction, but also, in a sense, presented herself as kimono. We see this in the 7-volume Kōda Aya Zenshu, or the collected works of Kōda Aya, published 1958 to 59, which literally wore kimonos. The The book covers were made of hand-woven cotton kimono fabric with a checkered pattern named the Kōda check. We can observe kimono language working here too, as this fabric was designed by a master dyer based on a pattern from the late Edo period, and quote, woven in a Tamba region style of traditional Mingei or folk art cloth, end quote. As down-to-earth cotton cloth with a casual pattern, it was lowest in terms of kimono rank and conveyed earthiness and everyday culture. But at the same time, such hand-woven kimono had also become a valuable example of Mingei, reflecting handmade authenticity, high quality, and cultural significance. The Kōda check fabric embodied the art and image of Kōda Aya, a down-to-earth yet serious and significant author. Kōda's abandonment of the novel Kimono in 1968 is on the one hand quite sad. Even after her close relationship with kimonos, she decided to move on to other things, having recognized the limits of this medium for communicating with the post-war readership. However, the story does not end quite there. It continues in a more hopeful way. The novel was published for the first time in 1993 and became part of the rediscovery of Kōda Aya. Although many authors enjoy revival and often a surge in book sales after their death, Kōda was given particular revalidation by the literary world. In 1993, a Japanese literary critic suggested that Kōda's works especially spoke to the current times which followed the collapse of the so-called bubble period, or the bubble economy, of the 1980s. From this perspective, the novel Kimono gained a new generation of readers in the 1990s when upscale brands and overconsumption had become gauche. Concerns about environment and recycling were further reinforced, and a more personal, unique experience with objects had come to be desired. Rutsuko's story addresses this need, as it is also about truly cherishing each item through careful use and restoration. Rutsuko's favorite habutai kimono that we have seen, for example, is worn throughout her youth. Even when it becomes faded, torn, and patched, she continues to wear it as a student, wearing it under a hakama so that the mended areas below the torso are hidden. This type of kimono representation may have been particularly attractive during the lost decade of the early 1990s. With the sudden economic downturn, expensive formal kimonos that had been part of a trend of conspicuous consumption by the wealthy were no longer desired. Rutsuko is not a rampant consumer expressing her identity through accumulation and trends, but someone who is able to fully utilize limited resources and appreciate the ways in which each garment carries meanings and stories. Already when it was first serialized in the 1960s, the novel functioned to question the new consumerism and the burgeoning culture of abundance during Japan's economic growth. Resurrected in the 1990s, these elements of the novel took on fresh relevancy. There were, of course, other factors for the posthumous success of the novel. For one, Kōda Aya's daughter, Aokitama, debuted as an essayist after her mother's death, writing about the family as well as their kimonos. She actively promoted Kōda Aya's kimono, as well as her new 23-volume collected works published from 1994 to 97. Aokitama's kimono essays features her mother and other family members. Their references to the novel Kimono and various themes from the novel are represented, including the idea of being educated through kimonos. These works, no doubt, sparked fresh interest in Rutsuko's story, and through their intertextual engagement, added layers of new meaning to Kōda's novel. In this way, Kōda's kimono was able to have a successful and very rich afterlife, years after its first appearance as a serialized work. Kōda's novel teaches us many things. It is not simply a text through which one gains insight into early 20th century kimono culture, but also a work that shows the creative and careful use of kimono language. And by reading the work contextually, not only at the time of its production, but also its resurrection, we can see how it took on various nuances at different historical moments. Despite Kōda's dystopic view, kimonos in contemporary Japan are still alive and still telling stories, both as material and literary objects. Especially since the 2000s and 2010s, scholars note new trends in kimono consumption, particularly the rise of secondhand kimono market, internet sales, new production technologies and fabrics, which have made kimonos more affordable. The interest in conserving and reusing old kimonos has been particularly noteworthy, and new roles and views of kimonos, for example, as a unique component of tourism experiences, global fashion, or popular culture, can be widely observed. Rules about protocol and other practices have loosened so that kimonos are more approachable and can be worn on different occasions, not just established formal events. Still considered exotic compared to Western wear, kimonos serve as vehicles of unique self-expression. Many aspects of the kimono and its place in the world are different from Kōda's and Rutsuko's youth about 100 years ago. Along with changes in kimono-related practices, many aspects of Kōda's kimono language may have become obscured or difficult to understand. But just as the kimono is alive today, kimono language continues to function in the 21st century. My own interest is 20th century kimono language, particularly aspects that need to be excavated and reaffirmed as an important means of literary and cinematic communication. But thankfully, the history of kimono and kimono language continues today, even as they are transforming. Today, I've shared a small part of my research on interpreting kimonos in modern literature. I've only scratched the surface of the novel itself and of what these textual objects can tell us. I hope, however, that in a general way, I've been able to show the value of reading through sartorial objects in order to think about both texts and contexts in new productive ways. For those of you interested in this topic, I discuss more in a book, hopefully that will be published soon. But some elements of my presentation today have been published in my article cited here. So please take a look at it and find more details and resources there. Thank you very much for coming to my talk today. I look forward to your questions and comments.
I just want to thank the Japan Foundation again, Grace and Genevieve and Nobu and Michiko for inviting me to moderate this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much to Japan Foundation, the staff, and Kim also. Despite the technical problems, I'm so glad that we're able to bring you this lecture and also the discussion in this format. It's wonderful to be able to share my research and to have a conversation about it with Kim. Kim and I both share a deep commitment to the study of Japanese women writers, and I really value and respect her work very much. So she's also read a lot of my chapters from the book manuscript, which hopefully will be published soon.
Great. So, Michiko, for some people, the kimono may represent a foreign, even exotic garment representing traditional Japanese identity. So, your examination of kimono language in literature and film responds to this monolithic image in a very nuanced way by looking at shifting meanings of kimono language over time. Why was it important to look at kimono language across the modern period?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yes, I think the kimono are usually seen as very static and set objects, usually associated with traditional Japan, national identity, often female identity. And so kind of seen as very static, but it's actually full of change, as I hope I explained in my talk. And feel free to jump in whenever, Kim. So change not only in terms of kimonos' fashion trends, but also how they were perceived or understood over time. So as I mentioned in my talk, during the war, they were considered unpatriotic, luxurious, frivolous objects. But after the war, the meaning or the coding of kimonos changed as objects that mirror traditional Japanese identity and associated with high culture. So really understanding kimono to me is about understanding not just kind of this material culture, but really understanding 20th century Japan. And so I thought it was very important for me to try to excavate meanings that are lost or shifted or misunderstood. And so in my work, I look at a whole range of things. I look at textiles, designs, for example, seasonal pictorial designs or things that have literary meaning, geometric patterns, sometimes, not all the time, but those could have meanings, the color, and of course the kimono itself, the construction of the kimono. And also when we say kimono, we forget that you can't just wear a kimono. You know, there's so many accoutrements that go into a kimono outfit. So in my book, I examine things like art undergarments, sandals, obi, the sash, things like that. And also, I thought it was important to think about the way in which in pre-modern or early modern literature, the practice of allusions is very common. And some people have forgotten that, but in 20th century literature too, that exists also. Pre-modernists are very well trained in the act of thinking about allusions. So if there's a clothing with a certain pattern or design on it that might be referencing a different literary text or a poem or something like that. So that happens within 20th century literature as well. But I don't just look at the object itself. I think about the kimono culture and its movement and its dynamic ways of functioning within human life. So in a literary text, there might be a scene of someone giving a kimono or receiving a kimono, selling a kimono, washing a kimono. So even those things people may have read just as, oh, these are things that happened. But if you know about kimonos and their meanings within that particular historical moment, there may be many layers of meaning. So these are things that I thought would be interesting to look at and very valuable to revisit 20th century literature from that perspective.
Yeah. You know, your study of kimono language really puts front and center, as you were saying, this body of knowledge that's been overlooked or perhaps even dismissed. And I think that's in part because of its association with women and their everyday lives. So I really appreciate how your work emphasizes the multi-layered complexities of kimono language and compels readers to look at the works of these women writers with a new critical lens. You talked earlier about our shared interest in women writers. Was this an important part of your research agenda?
Yeah, it really was. So my first book was on women writers of the early 20th century. And I essentially talked about kind of ideology and information flows, how these women writers were using or thinking about the notion of love in their writing and how that information shaped a lot of what they were doing in the text. And I knew I wanted to continue my work on women writers, but from a different perspective. So this book actually has a lot of women writers in it. And as you said, Kim, I think garments have been associated with the domestic world or the feminine world. And so they may have been overlooked, particularly in literary studies, as something maybe not really worth looking at. And so we've often discussed how women writers are also often overlooked at various points in time. And just like the women writers, these garments, these everyday objects were also overlooked. So I thought it would be a very important avenue of inquiry. One of the authors I discuss in my book, Tsuboi Sakae, is respected as a writer of the people, but also kind of ignored as somebody who writes children's books, often discussed as a kind of regional writer. But when you actually look at her literary texts, there are so many objects and clothing within them, and really talking very intimately about domestic life in ways that maybe people have overlooked. Another author, Miao Tomiko, a very successful popular writer, but perhaps ignored by scholars. And her experiences with kimono are also very important. So I think I bring a different take or a different framework for looking at women writers, but it's still very much part of my interests.
So you talk about, how your work is sort of bringing new perspectives to the work of these women writers like Tsuboi or Miao. But I also know that you've analyzed kimono language in works by male writers, such as Tanizaki Junichiro. Did you see a difference in the ways that male and female writers used kimono language?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think it's true that women definitely had more of an intimate, familiar relationship with kimonos because they were mainly the ones doing the, sewing and washing and maintenance as part of domestic life. And men, for the most part, unless they were artisans, didn't really have to train in the art of sewing, for example. But this doesn't mean that men didn't have familiarity with kimono. So just as there are women writers who have great expertise and connoisseurship with regard to kimono, there were also men like that as well. So I think it's a little dangerous sometimes to think about these differences purely across gender lines. I think it's very kind of author specific and also work specific and what it meant during that historical time. But certainly Tanizaki, I think, is very well known as a kimono connoisseur who knew a lot about kimonos. Also learned a lot from his wife Matsuko. And so his writing does very interesting things with kimonos as well.
Another thing that comes up for me after we've been talking about gender a little bit is class. I think some readers might associate kimono with luxurious silk fabrics, those expensive accoutrements that you were talking about, which suggests the importance of class in the reading of kimono language. What role would you say class plays in reading these texts that you've been addressing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, class definitely plays an important role too. But it is true that we always get this kind of sense that kimono is for the upper classes or upper middle classes. But kimono really was just clothing. And so even if you only had one garment per season, as many impoverished people did, they're still, incredibly important. And we need to understand all experiences of class. So, so if there's anything I would want people to learn from this discussion and lecture is that kimonos are heterogeneous. They're incredibly diverse. Different regions might treat kimonos differently. The meanings might change there. different historical moments, we'll see different kimono patterns, or the way you wear a kimono or what it means very differently. So I think the one thing to take away is that wafuku, or Japanese wear in general, is quite diverse, and we need to remember that.
So in the recorded talk, you discuss literary work by Kōda Aya, but I also know in reading other chapters in the manuscript, you've also looked at both literary and cinematic texts. So I'm wondering why you chose to examine both types of texts and what differences you encountered in looking at kimono language in these different media.
Yeah, thank you for that question also. So in my book, I look at literature and film, as it's in the tentative title. But the way I use film is very specific. So I look at the films that are cinematic adaptations of the novels that I'm exploring. And as you could tell from my talk, I'm very interested in issues of the afterlife of texts. And oftentimes novels, one of the novels' afterlives is that they become turned into film. And so I thought it would be important to pursue this avenue of thinking about the afterlife of novels and kimono language there. So what I found out as I did this research was that film is more kind of multi-directional, let's say. So in a text, you could have kimono descriptions just as words on a page. And that can involve a lot of directions too. But in film, the agents who create meaning are more. It's multi-directional. So you have the original story, so that defines how kimono is depicted. In most of the films I discuss, the director really has a kind of hands-on approach about what garments are chosen and how they're worn. We usually have a costume person, handling that as well in film production. And then, kimono just doesn't exist. People are actually wearing them. So they're actors playing these characters that are from the original novel, but they add a different meaning because there's also the star image of the actor. So not only are they creating meaning as characters, just by their screen presence wearing kimono and doing things, these actors present a different level of meaning through their star image. Then you have framing, lighting, color. People move differently in a kimono, so bodily movements. So there's all sorts of multi-directional processes of creating meaning. And I really discovered that I had to look at kind of the whole picture from different perspectives. So it's really fascinating to combine the two, both text and cinema, in this project.
That's great. So my next question has to do with the future in terms of thinking about how, while your research addresses kimono language from the early 20th century to the early 21st century, what directions do you see for future research on this topic?
Yeah, so right now it's a great time to be studying kimonos because more museums and more scholars are really interested in this topic, and people are studying it from all sorts of different perspectives. So towards the end of my book, I talk about film and television series from 2010s. So, kimono language is being used in different ways even today. And this doesn't include, of course, historical drama, historical novels. These genres are set in the past. So by default, the characters or the people in them are wearing kimonos. So I actually don't look at that in my research, but that's very much alive as well. So for the future, there have been, and I'm sure there will be, many anthropologists and sociologists who work on kimonos. And I think this is a really interesting time for kimono studies. I think if you look at things like tourism studies through the kimono, that would be a really fascinating area, because many places in Japan now, tourism is connected with the experience of kimono and experiencing these tourist sites while wearing a kimono. And because the industry is changing so much, I think it would be very useful and helpful for us to have scholars studying artisans and people in the industry, because the way we create, consume, these kinds of ways of approaching kimonos is really changing. So to be able to understand that in more detail would be really helpful, I think. And then I think in terms of studies of popular culture would be another interesting area. Cultural studies, popular culture people, they might want to study things like cosplay and manga and anime, and hopefully people are or will do it, so that we get a, kind of a bigger way of framework for understanding kimono in Japan studies.
That's great. Those are really helpful directions for young researchers interested in kimono language.
You and I can talk on for a long time, but if we can take some of the the Eventbrite questions that were sent earlier.
Thank you very much for that discussion. I think we touched on a few of the points brought up by our audience on Eventbrite, some of the questions we got from the pre-registration, but maybe there are a few that we can discuss now. So your discussion ended on the future of this field, the future of kimono studies, but we had a question that is looking to the past. We have a question that asks, do you find that there is any semblance between the reading of kimono descriptions in contemporary literature and that of more historical literature?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really great question. So by more historical, I guess I would interpret that to mean older texts. So because now kimonos are no longer part of everyday wear for most people, contemporary descriptions in literature is quite different in that sense. So in the text, particularly written in the past, where kimonos were part of everyday life, there was this kind of shared vocabulary that was probably a little bit more intense. There was probably more detail. So in general, we can say that there's a difference. But again, I think it's a little bit dangerous to generalize, because there are certain genres, like I was saying with Kim, like historical novels or historical drama, usually featuring, set in the Edo or Tokugawa period. So featuring samurai warriors. And in those genres, people still need to know how kimonos were worn, what kind of clothing were worn, what people ate, how the classes interacted. So that's still part of this very important language that these authors have to write. And I don't think that the importance has gone away for people writing today in these genres and people who wrote 100 years ago. So I think it just kind of depends on the field, and also different authors have different styles as well.
Thank you. I wonder if in some of this contemporary literature that takes place in the past, like a historical novel, I wonder how authors are able to explain to the reader what kimono mean. Do you find that there's indexes or glossaries in the back, terms to reference, or are readers expected to do their own research?
Right, and that's a really interesting idea. I think I've seen some works where there are a little bit of a gloss at the end, when it's an important part of the story, whether or not it's historical fiction or not. Within historical fiction, I think there's basically an understanding between reader and author about the world that they're depicting. And in those ones, unless it's like a major feature, it's more of like, how real can you describe the world of, 17th, 18th century Japan. So maybe the way the language is used is different. But, some authors really get into it. Other people don't write as much. And so, yeah, I think there's a whole, kind of spectrum.
Interesting. Okay. Well, since this is a talk on material culture, we had a few questions about the materiality of kimonos. Maybe I can group some of these questions together. We had a comment, is there a sensual pleasure in the tactile differences among different weaves and materials of fabric? And also, does every pattern in kimono have meaning?
Yeah, so great questions. Actually, one of the really interesting things about this novel, Kōda Aya's novel, Kimono, is that there's so many descriptions of the feeling of fabric on your skin. And that is actual knowledge that's, fading away. Because unless you're a very specific person, you're not going to have the experience of wearing certain kinds of silks or certain kinds of linens or something like that. So through description, Kōda Aya is teaching us how sensual or how they feel, and also how difficult some textiles are as when you're wearing it into a kimono, because some are very slippery, so it's hard to walk in them, or kimono is about layering, so the more you layer, it's hard to keep it all in one place, and certain fabrics allow you to do that, where others are a little bit more, you need to tie things up in a very skilled way. So these are kind of knowledge that maybe people had more familiarity with, that Kōda tries to explain. And that element of the tactile nature of fabric is very important in this text. In terms of patterns, so there are things like pictorial designs and then geometric patterns, and not all of them have meaning, or the meaning is different in different contexts. So you could have geometric patterns that might have meaning in one context, only worn in certain contexts, but then in others, it has different meanings and other people can wear them. Pictorial designs usually depict a kind of seasonal meaning, but it's very, you kind of have to look at the big picture. So I wouldn't say they always have meaning, whether it's just real kimonos worn by real people, and also in literature, because there's certainly descriptions of kimono, of design that is mainly for realism or kind of, extra explanations or something like that. So again, it's very contextual and it's hard to generalize, but that's a great question.
Building off of what a kimono's pattern may or may not mean, depending on context, are there rules about when to wear kimono and when not to wear kimono?
Yeah, so this is also a question that I sometimes get. And it's not necessarily a matter of when or when not to wear a kimono, but what kind of kimono can you wear to certain events or seasons or situations, and it's very kind of difficult rules and things like that. So things are loosening up a little bit in terms of rules, but there's still certain protocol that you must follow in wearing kimono. So for those of you who are interested in this aspect of kimono, Liza Dalby's book, Kimono, is a great resource in English explaining the different protocols and rules of kimonos in general.
Thank you. And I think we have one last one from the audience. You touched a little bit on misconceptions and things you want the audience to understand about kimono already in your discussion with Dr. Kono. Are there any other commonly held thoughts about kimono in the West or other kinds of misconceptions that you'd like to challenge in your work?
Right. Well, one comment I often get outside of Japan is that many people tell me they're surprised that men also wear kimonos. And that's something that we in Japan studies just kind of take for granted, but perhaps it's not, perhaps it's understandable, this misunderstanding, because so much of cultural representations are of women wearing kimonos. So that's one misconception. Another one is that I think many people believe that kimonos just are, they're just there in this form forever. But they are taken apart and re-dyed. And of course, that practice is changing now because people don't wear kimono as much. But there's a sense of fluidity and change and possibilities with a kimono that's not just static, although it can be, of course, handed down through the generations. So maybe that's something, again, I keep saying they're heterogeneous and they're not static, they're very fluid. So those are kind of the two main points I would say are very important to me.
Thank you. And may I add a question of my own?
Yeah, please go ahead, Grace.
So this is partially due to my own lack of research, but I wonder if English readers can find a translation of Kimono by Kōda Aya. And if not, what other works are available to an English-speaking audience that you might recommend to people who want to see or read more about kimono in Japanese literature and film?
Yeah, so of course I would like to advertise my book. So updates on my research will be on the UC Davis website. So hopefully it will come out and people will be able to read it. But a lot of the books on kimono, kimono itself, the Kōda Aya book is not translated. And so that would be a very interesting project. I mean, I've thought about, the possibilities of what it would mean to translate a work like that. And it would be a huge undertaking. But yeah, there are definitely works that I think people might be interested in. Maybe I'll give a shout out to my colleague and senpai, Rebecca Copeland. I know that her work, which is her novel, I mean, she has done so much for the field of Japan studies and modern Japanese women writers, but she is coming out with a novel. And I believe the title is called Kimono Tattoo. So there must be kimono language in there. So that might be a fun read for people to look at. But yeah, once my book is out, maybe people can look at the different references there.
Definitely. We'll have to stay tuned for that. And Dr. Kono, do you have any projects coming down the pipeline that we can keep an eye on?
I'm finishing up a manuscript on Japanese women in colonial Manchuria and looking at both women writing about their experience there, but also the ways in which images of Japanese women were used in promoting different projects on the continent. So that's all right. That's in progress.
So we'll have to keep an eye on your respective faculty pages to see these publications come out. Well, thank you both so much, both for your time and your flexibility. Thank you to our audience this evening as well. We again apologize for the unsolvable technical issues that we experienced on March the 29th, but we hope you're watching again this evening and we hope you enjoyed it nevertheless. That's all the time that we have for this evening. If you are interested in funding to conduct research in Japan, please follow the links in our description bar below to learn more about our Japanese Studies Fellowship Program. Also, we have interviews and other lectures available right here on this YouTube channel. So please follow along. Thank you again so much for joining us. Stay safe and stay tuned for more lectures. Thank you.